who wields the truth? The marketing teams at tech and EV companies wield the truth, or is it the Congolese people? Because they're telling completely opposite stories. The people on the ground in the Congo are telling a story of pillage, suffering, penny wages, and death to feed cobalt up the chain. The companies at the top of the chain are talking about human rights, zero tolerance policies on child labor, sustainable mining practices. Please look the other way and upgrade your phone this year. So we have to all think, who do we want to believe?
Once again, the resources of the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, are at the center of global demand. First, the world came for its rubber, then its gold, copper, and now, cobalt, the mineral used in the batteries that power our modern-day rechargeable lifestyles. The extraction of cobalt is a difficult story to tell, and the limited coverage that does come out paints a grim picture of exploitation and environmental damage. In the eastern region, there is a conflict that has been ongoing since 1996. An estimated 6 million people have been killed, more than 7 million displaced. The fighting is taking place far away from the cobalt mines, but it complicates everything. To show you how tightly controlled the cobalt story is and why, we start in the DRC's largest city. It's bustling, heavily policed, and sometimes volatile. It's the perpetually chaotic capital, Kinshasa. Journalists are accustomed to going through certain hoops to gain access, legal access to a story. But in the DRC, getting close to the mining story is especially arduous. It's taken us 2 months and thousands of dollars to get my visa and press accreditation. And to give you an idea of the bureaucracy we had to navigate, look at all the stamps from the various government bodies that we collected along the way. And despite all of this, we don't have permission to go to the south of the country, where the mines are. That's still a work in progress.
Coverage of cobalt mining in particular is a sensitive issue for a variety of reasons. Obviously, mining in the DRC represents a large share of domestic revenue and of the Congolese economy. There are a fringe of pretty influential Congolese politicians and military elites who have personal stakes in the industry. I also think that the nature of mining and how mining concessions are structured makes it difficult to access and to report.
After getting the last approval that we needed from Kinshasa, we flew to Lubumbashi, the second largest city in the DRC and the gateway to the cobalt mines. The sector is divided in two: regulated industrial mines operated by big mining companies. They use heavy machinery and produce 80% of the DRC's cobalt. The remaining 20% comes from unregulated artisanal mines that are dug manually, which make them much more dangerous. Lubumbashi is also where most of the Congolese journalists who cover the mining sector are based, like Frank Fwamba, the editor of Mining News magazine. What has been your experience covering this sector? As someone that focuses on the mining industry, have there been any challenges or dangers that you've faced while trying to do your job?
Are there any dangers? When you go to the mining site, don't expect to be greeted with cheers. The miners are worried. They want to know who does what and why. So if you're not well supervised, or people aren't prepared for your presence, there may be frustration that leads to poor choices and dangerous situations.
There is some hesitation about confiding or sharing lived experiences with outsiders, in part because of that press. The portrayal of human rights abuses has an impact on the local economy, on foreign investment, which in turn has impact on people's livelihoods.
I would do interviews under the cover of darkness. We'd arrange a safe place with trusted guides, transport villagers before dawn to that site. Then I would do interviews, keep them there for the day, and then return them after sunset. Now, mind you, most people don't want to talk because there's enormous peril associated with revealing the truth.
From Lubumbashi, we catch a bus west to what's known as the cobalt capital of the world, Kolwezi. Around 70% of the global supply of cobalt comes from this small patch of the DRC. As we get closer, the hallmarks of extraction start to present themselves. The road is well traveled, but it's also treacherous. When we reach Kolwezi, we find a town on the edge of an industrial mine where we will have to wait for our final approval to go to the mines. Candy Afime went to Kolwezi in 2022 to document the impact that industrial mining was having on the surrounding communities.
We spoke to over 130 people, met with company officials. What we found is that the communities that really live on or around mineral-rich land are really not the beneficiaries of that activity. Worse, many of them have to live their homes and their farmland forcibly without minimum, safeguards. One of the cases we looked into, the community explained to us that in 2016, their informal settlement was completely erased from the map with the participation of the Congolese military that destroyed their informal settlements, and we were able to corroborate that information through the review of satellite imagery.
The largest cobalt mining concession in the southeastern Congo is the size of London. So you have to imagine a London-sized concession multiplied several times over that's been ripped apart. And all the people who used to live in that concession displaced, pushed to the fringes of existence. Now there's no way for them to survive except to scrounge back into that territory where they used to live and try to fill a sack of cobalt for the day.
These groups of people would move into the artisanal mining sector, and it's known to be a family affair. Typically, the men do the digging, the women wash the cobalt, and the children have been known to work as well. But many have to go with their parents to the mines because even though they can be deadly for poverty-stricken families, that's the only option.
There are plenty of dangers in artisanal mining. The material is radioactive, and very often the miners work without protective clothing or equipment. No gloves, no masks, no glasses. They expose themselves to harm because raw cobalt is toxic. It leads to disease and birth defects.
A family unit will work 12 hours in hazardous, toxic conditions to fill up 1 or 2 sacks, which they will sell to the industrial mining company for the equivalent of $1 or $2 of income a day. And if they suffer a shattered leg, a broken neck, or God forbid, they are buried alive in a tunnel collapse, they'll just bring in the next family. And that's how this fever, this scramble for cobalt is being met.
You have to get your heads around this. Artisanal workers are not state employees. They are part of cooperatives. We realized that at one point the cooperative managers did not have protective equipment for workers. We realized that they weren't trained in the correct digging and operating procedures. We are talking about landslides happening when things are poorly done. But many of the mining companies don't cooperate with journalists because when we cover this sector, there are hard questions that need to be answered.
This is one of the thousands of unregulated, unmonitored mines in the DRC. It's crawling with children, working like modern-day slaves.
In an explosive report in 2017, Sky News in the UK showed that child labor was being used extensively in an artisanal mine in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC.
An army of children are at the heart of the mining production.
Companies like Apple said that they would stop purchasing cobalt from artisanal mines and get their supply only from the industrial regulated sector. But, according to a report in the New Yorker 4 years later, as soon as the media attention died down, the practice of buying artisanal mined cobalt continued.
Tech and EV companies will have us believe there's this thick wall between commercial industrial mining with heavy equipment and then this artisanal activity. And the ground truth, the reality is, it's all coming into the formal supply chain.
When the ores leave the shaft, you can trace it to a point. But then it gets taken to stalls outside the big mines and is bought by traders who go on to sell it to other larger companies.
And it's at that point that what was dug by a child and what might have been excavated by some heavy machinery is mixed together, and from that point forward, it's impossible to discriminate.
What we found interesting is that big tech entities that make billions of dollars have such difficulty with traceability. Obviously, supply chain mapping is a difficult exercise, but if an organization like Amnesty is able to map out this route, which is much harder because we don't have access to a whole host of confidential information, really the onus is on them. And that's why it's not enough for companies to say, well, you know, we are not able to really understand what's happening at the point of extraction.
Being at the center of global demand is a story that the Congolese know all too well. The first time it happened was with the invention of the automobile in the late 19th century. The cars needed tires, rubber tires. Belgium's King Leopold II was the colonial ruler of what was then ironically called the Free State of Congo. During his reign, the Congolese were tortured, mutilated, and murdered in the millions to force them to meet the demand. The violence of that era is not being repeated in the DRC today, but the current global demand for cobalt is being driven by necessity. To slow the climate crisis, the world needs to transition to renewable energy, which is unlikely to happen without cobalt. The DRC sits atop an estimated 3.4 million metric tons of it, almost half of the known supply.
The Congo is blessed with enormous resource wealth, blessed but also cursed, because throughout history, this resource wealth has attracted imperialists and pirates and pillagers, kings of state and kings of industry to plunder those resources for their enrichment.
You cannot understand or really grasp what's happening in the Congolese mining sector today without taking stock of the Congolese colonial history. Today, the world is undergoing another global transition. We're trying to move away from fossil fuels, and once again, the Congo has the resources that are critical for the world to make that transition.
Who happens to have more of the world's cobalt than anywhere else? Congo. And so it's just the new story. Instead of a King Leopold, you have King Tech, but it's the same dynamic of foreign powers needing a treasure.
On our last day in the DRC, we finally get permission to go to the mines. I've been assigned 2 minders. They're seated behind me, but we're not allowed to film them. We are told that they are here for our protection, but undoubtedly, they're keeping an eye on us as well. Again, accidents along the way delay our journey. This one was fatal. So by the time we reach the mines, the diggers are done for the day, and we would not get to see the mine in full operation. The process of getting to the mines is cumbersome, the system inefficient, and some of the delays seem deliberate. You get a sense as you go through each step that there is little desire, if not a reluctance, to help journalists get here. Which is unsurprising. Many of the connected elite here have grown very rich from cobalt, and they don't want negative coverage jeopardizing their income.
We traveled along collapsing dirt roads. Children are everywhere, digging for cobalt in a...
Because when journalists do get this far, many come back with stories of blood batteries or blood cobalt.
Ah, so this is cobalt. This is what people in this region are digging and dying for.
But despite the exploitation and hazardous working conditions on these mines, cobalt does not meet the definition of a conflict mineral. There is no fighting in this part of the country. So characterizations that suggest it is oversimplifies a complicated issue.
Vous savez, les médias parfois met les titres sensationnels.
The media can be sensationalist, and coining the phrase blood cobalt isn't correct, because no one is being murdered. No one is holding a gun to these miners and forcing them to produce cobalt.
Il n'y a personne qui a une arme et qui force les gens à produire le cobalt.
Nos collègues occidentaux savent que
Western journalists can be superficial at times. Their research isn't always as thorough as it should be. There's always a kernel of truth in their reporting, but it's not 100%. I do pity our Western colleagues because they're not given enough time to conduct a thorough investigation. It's always for 2 or 3 days, which doesn't allow them to speak to different people or communities and cross-check information.
Au moins, vous pouvez recouper l'information. It was really important to make sure that the story that is being told is the story that emerges from Congolese people, meaning it's very dangerous to fall into the trap that you hear around blood cobalt that are really portraying Congolese people as victims, as subjects to those dynamics in a way that's very dehumanizing. And ultimately what Congolese people are saying is really the energy transition shouldn't be at the cost of our land, our air, and we should benefit from it.
An estimated $6 billion worth of cobalt is extracted from the DRC each year, and yet artisanal miners earn just a few dollars a day. It is evident that in the DRC, it is the ruling class that benefits disproportionately from the country's mineral wealth. But the real money is in big tech. In 2022, Apple's annual revenue was nearly $395 billion. Microsoft turned over $198 billion, and for Tesla, it was $81 billion. But inherent in those figures is not only corporate exploitation, but also consumer complicity.
Parce que c'est anormal que Elon Musk avec Tesla.
It's abnormal that Elon Musk from Tesla, Bill Gates from Microsoft, Tim Cook at Apple are earning billions each year, but are not sharing this prosperity with the people who live where cobalt comes from.
Ça doit être de l'équité.
There has to be distributive justice. Those companies need to invest back into the country, because so many of the problems in this sector are linked to poverty. And with a better share of the wealth, those problems could cease to exist.
On voit que ces problèmes ne vont pas exister.
All of us have to rethink our consumption habits, because each time we consume, we are contributing to those demand-side forces that have unleashed this violence on the people of the Congo. All of us are participating in this, unwittingly. When you bought your smartphone, or I bought mine, or anyone listening to this conversation bought their smartphone, or their laptop, or their electric vehicle, we didn't think to ourselves, aha, now when I plug in today, some child in the Congo is gonna die. But that's the relationship that's been forced on us by tech companies, because these companies have not seen fit to take responsibility for the people in the heart of Africa and treat them with respect and dignity. And we should be upset about that.
In 1904, this image started circulating around the world. It shows a Congolese man looking at the severed hand and foot of his murdered 5-year-old daughter. It was his punishment for failing to produce enough rubber. The image exposed the horrors of King Leopold's reign, and he was forced to give up the Congo. And while the demand for rubber didn't ease, its procurement became more ethical. The images coming out of the DRC today don't show the same kind of atrocities, but they do tell a story of suffering and exploitation. And while the coverage may be rare, in today's interconnected world that the Congolese helped to build, we can't say that we didn't know.
Thanks for watching. Now hit that like button and leave us a comment to let us know what you think about anything that we covered this week. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter. Does anyone really call it X? Facebook and Instagram for updates from the show. Links are in the description.